Hello, everyone. Welcome to the September Real Talk about real estate. My name is Michelle, and I am one of the marketing leads for the ABR designation. Today, I am very excited to be joined by Lynn Madison of Madison Seminars and a Reback Hall of Fame inductee. We are going to cover compensation and why it's super important as a buyer's rep to understand the process and be able to explain it to your clients. As a reminder, we are live, so if you have any comments or questions, feel free to let us know and we'll do our best to answer them. Lynn, why are we here? Why are we having this conversation?
Well, thank you for having me, and hello to everybody, all of my fellow ABRs. So we're glad that you're here. So we're here because there's a number of current legal issues going on surrounding the whole conversation of compensation in the real estate industry. These issues have been discussed in many, many other courses and venues. So we're not going to take up our limited time here this morning talking about the lawsuits and going through what's in them, et cetera. But because most of you have heard about all of that. These are lawsuits that have been filed. And some of them are just regular lawsuits, attorneys filing against us and other MLSs and brokerage companies. But there was a lawsuit from the DOJ, the Department of Justice, and they're constantly changing. These lawsuits are, the complaints are changing, but the basics are the same. And that's that the sellers are having a problem with us forcing them to pay buyer brokerage compensation. And that's kind of the crux of the issues. So in a nutshell, a variety of lawsuits filed and working their way through the courts claiming that sellers are being forced to pay buyer brokerage compensation with no negotiation. And the DOJ, as I said, filed their lawsuit that created another whole series of conversations and caused us to take a look at the conversations that we've been having with our sellers and our buyers and how we've been talking about compensation. And maybe we need to change that a little bit so that it doesn't sound quite the same as the way we've been making it sound. All right. Now, with that said, there were some changes that were made by the National Association in November of 21, when we were at the meetings in November, that took effect in 22. So those I felt we should at least touch on this morning before we jump into the rest of this. So those two changes were, number one, it's a change to Standard of Practice 12-1 in the Code of Ethics that now clearly states that we cannot say that our buyer brokerage services are free or no cost at all to the buyers if we are getting paid from any source. So we all know that if we have a buyer representation agreement with our buyers, that we have to disclose how much they're going to pay us. Of course we do. But if I don't have a buyer representation agreement with my buyers, or if I am foolish and put zero in the compensation, I'm getting all of my compensation from the listing side, but my buyer is in fact paying it in the amount of money he pays to the seller. So here we are saying it's free, and the DOJ said, no, it's not. And we changed the code. So everybody needs to be aware that it changed. And the second thing that changed was an internal change within the MLSs. Because now the MLS in the data feed, that's the IDX feed. The IDX feed is the data feed that goes from the MLSs to your websites. I'm making this a very simple explanation. And that's so that your website then can get all of the accurate data about all of the listings and put it on your website. So that data feed now must include the offer of buyer brokerage compensation that is being offered. So on websites across the country, we are now seeing, and the consumer is now seeing on the websites, how much compensation the buyer brokerage is receiving when the buyer buys that property. So it is becoming very transparent. It's becoming out and we now have to be able to have conversations with our sellers, and we're only touching briefly on the sellers today. We're going to focus on the buyers about compensation, and that's why we're here. because all of these changes, the lawsuits and the changes in the code, et cetera, are causing us to have to change our conversation with our clients. And as a matter of fact, we just updated the ABR course within the last, I'd say, 6 or 7 months. And the major focus of that update, because I was involved in that, was to improve on and beef up and focus on our buyer counseling session. Because we've got to do a better job of explaining to the buyers what we bring to the table. Because a lot of buyers think all we do is just sit around drinking Starbucks, driving cars that are paid for by our brokerage companies, and waiting for them to find the house they want to see on the internet. We show them if they think that's the only thing we do, it's no wonder they don't understand why we're worth what we're worth. So we really beefed that up. So I encourage all of you, if you that already have your ABR, if it's been a few years since you've taken the course, the next time the course is being done in your area, you might want to talk to your association, whoever's hosting it, and see if there's an audit fee. Does that make sense? Because usually there is, that you can sit through the course again, because there's a whole lot of really good new information in the course that will really help you. We're going to touch on some of it today. So what does all of this mean then? These lawsuits and this outside pressure that we have on our business right now. In states where buyer representation agreements are required, and you know what is required in your state. Some states require them, some do not. But in the states where buyer rep agreements are required, or if you work for a brokerage company that requires you to use a buyer representation agreement, either way, then you're already having the conversation about compensation with your buyers. It's been a necessity for you to explain your value proposition to the buyers. Because they're not going to sign a contract with you, just like we do with the sellers. I think we're all very, very good at explaining to the sellers what we do for them to help them get the most money, the quickest sale with the least amount of inconvenience, and get their transaction to the closing table. We got that because we need to explain that, or they won't sign a listing agreement with us. Well, you're not going to get a buyer to sign a buyer rep agreement unless you can do the same thing on the buy side. So some of you are already very, very good at this because you've been using buyer rep agreements. But we find that in the states where buyer representation agreements are not required, that most of the brokerage companies are not requiring their agents to use them. The agents are not using them. And now we're finding that our agents are struggling with having the conversation with the buyers about compensation because they've never had to do it before. So what I wanted to do today is to open up this dialogue, if you will, to help you with that. Because if we don't have clarity on what's going on here in our own heads, then we're going to have a hard time explaining what's going on to the buyers and the sellers. And as I said, because it's becoming very transparent about the compensation, it's being published on websites. And that was an NAR directive to the MLSs. So if it's not happening already in your marketplace, the MLSs were all given a certain length of time. My MLS has already done it. So I've kind of lost track of when the deadline is of when it all has to be done, but I know it's coming up very soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess I want to touch on that briefly because that's something that I didn't know about. So that consumers can now see that commission. Like I personally have not noticed that. So that's something I'm going to look out for now because that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And not all brokerage companies. So there's another piece to that part of it. The brokerage companies can decide for themselves whether or not they want the buyer brokerage compensation that's being offered to be published on their websites. Does that make sense? So I do know some brokerage companies in the Chicago area, which is where I'm from, who have made the choice they're not going to put it on their websites. But I can also tell you that I can go to 3 very large brokerage companies in my marketplace and I can find it in a heartbeat. So it's up to the brokerage company. So depending on what website you're on, you might not see it because it's the brokerage company to decide it. Yeah.
I guess I was thinking about like a website where you'd find like property listings, not necessarily like the brokerage's website. So that makes more sense to me now.
Yes, wherever the property listings show up, And they've got all that information, and it says this is one of our listings, or this is a listing from a co-op broker. That's where it has to show up. That's where it will show up. Doesn't have to. I have to be careful how I say that. Where it could show up is probably a better way to say it. So I would suggest for all of you that you take a look at some of the websites in your marketplace. If your MLS has already started putting the brokerage, buyer brokerage compensation in the IDX feed, and you would know that, or your managing brokers would know that, and they should have let you know. But take a look to see whether or not it's showing up in your marketplace, because I think it does. We see it driving this conversation, is my point. Because the buyers are saying to their buyer agents, what does this mean? Do I have to pay you this money? Do I owe you this money? And that's why we're having this conversation today, so that we can explain a little bit better to the buyers how all of this is handled. Okay. So what we've got then, and I've been calling it this since all of this started back in, well, the first lawsuit was filed in 2019. The DOJ was 2020. So this is all still going on right now. This is a paradigm shift. And the definition of a paradigm shift is a fundamental change in an approach to anything. It doesn't have to be our business. It could be any business that causes old ways of thinking and doing things to become irrelevant. We've had paradigm shifts before in the real estate business, because for those of you who've been around for a while, you're seasoned, you remember when we were not buyer agents. We were all sub-agents of the sellers. The phrase we used back then was caveat emptor, buyer beware. Largest single investment they're going to make in their lives, and they had no representation. All the way up until the mid-90s, that's the case.
Wow.
So it took some of our brokerage companies a long time to make that huge shift from I don't represent the buyer to now I am a buyer representative, which is why NAR brought the ABR course to us, because we were struggling with trying to figure out how to make that shift. So that's what we're dealing with right now, is what I think we're all lovingly referring to as a paradigm shift. So I want to start with the sellers for just a moment, because you almost have to have this conversation about the sellers so that we can then get to our conversation with the buyers. Because right now, the big conversation is who is actually paying the buyer brokerage compensation, because all of the lawsuits and the sellers are all saying we're paying it. It's coming from the seller's side of the closing statement. No argument there. But the compensation is really coming from the buyers. In the amount of money the buyer paid the seller for the house, it gave the seller the money to pay the compensation. And I'm going to even go so far as to say on both sides of the transaction. Your sellers had no money to pay anybody anything until my buyer showed up at the closing with either buckets full of cash or a 30-year mortgage he's going to be paying on for umpteen years. And out of that amount of money comes our compensation. I don't know that we've been explaining it quite that way to the buyers, but it is not necessarily coming out of the seller's proceeds. It is coming out of the seller's proceeds, but my buyer gave the seller the money. So to say that it didn't cost the buyer anything to use a buyer agent is wrong, because it does. All right. So our conversation with our sellers are going to have to change as well. And just to mention to you, the course that we have at NAR, the SRS course, Seller Representative Specialist course, also has all of the changes in it. So we've done everything we can to update all of the courses for you. So just wanted to make sure you knew that. So the listing compensation plus the buyer brokerage compensation equals the total compensation. So we need to talk to the sellers about compensation as two parts added together to make a whole. And the total compensation is paid by the buyer and the seller in the agreed upon sales price of the house. This is not a change. This is the way it's been forever, but we just haven't been saying it that way. So we just need to make sure that the sellers understand that. NAR has put together, and it's at a website called competition.realtor, a plethora of aids for us to be able to use to help explain this. This one is an analysis of the average home buyer in this country does not have enough money after they're done with their down payment to also pay our compensation. It's important that we have that conversation with the sellers, because if we come down to offer of compensation in the MLS is not mandatory, I'll get into that in a second, then the sellers are likely to say, I don't want to pay buyer brokerage compensation. And we need to get them to understand that the average buyer, the buyers playing in a mid to lower price range sandbox, so to speak, they don't have any extra money to pay the compensation. They don't have it. And we're going to have to figure out a way to be able to explain that. So I want to make sure, and I know that Michelle wanted to talk a little bit about some of the resources as well, didn't you? About that's at competition.realtor.
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily even at competition.realtor, but just from the REBAC member center and the REBAC member benefits. Did you want me to talk about that right now?
Yeah, you want to do it now, because this might be a good.
Okay, I can go over that now. So, like Lynn said, competition.realtor, that's NAR's, one-stop shop for everything related to, how to explain the compensation conversation and the lawsuits and everything that's going on with that. But in terms of how that affects you as a buyer's rep, that obviously is going to be on our side at abr.realtor and homebuying.realtor, our site for consumers. So, we've got commissions information on homebuying.realtor, and we've got some really great blog posts on homebuying.realtor as well. So those are blog posts that are targeted to consumers. So, we've got information on, what happens from contract to closing. And we also have a consumer one sheet. So similar language, but this is something that you can print out, you can customize and give to your buyer clients, which explains the whole process.
Yeah.
Because I know, like myself, when I was buying a home, I was like, wait, what happens now? So, even if you have a really good agent that explains everything to you, sometimes you want that tangible piece of paper in front of you explaining everything, just in case. And then we also have, we touched on this slightly earlier, but we have a one sheet on 5 reasons to sign a buyer representation agreement, which is, that's huge for us. We are always encouraging our designees to use that. So this explains to consumers why we're pushing it, why it's important. And then just like how with the contract to closing, we also have a blog post on homebuying.realtor about the buyer representation agreement as well, if you would like to share that information, on your blog or in an email or, on social media. So, so those are the REBAC member benefits that we have that relate to this topic.
So we just wanted you to know that there are resources there for you. So when we're done with what we're talking about in our brief time together this morning, that there's still stuff out there that we at REBAC have brought to you, as well as NAR as the mothership, for you to be able to expand on on the conversations. So I want to talk to you about what a lot of people are talking about, which is, what if we end up with no mandatory offer of compensation in the MLS? There are many people who believe that when these lawsuits are done, that may be where we end up. And even at that, right now, all of our MLSs have a mandatory offer of compensation, but I can put $1 in there. And we are already across the country starting to see a whole lot more listings in the MLS with $1 offer of compensation. And as far as I'm concerned, $1 might as well be no dollars.
Right.
Because by the time I'm done sharing $1 with my brokerage company, I don't have much money left.
I think you got negative money.
Yeah, I got negative money. Exactly. So we need to, that's what we want to talk about, is what if that comes down to that. So we need to be able to explain what happens if I am a buyer agent and I have a buyer representation agreement with my buyer. That means I establish my compensation at the time of the agreement. I'm not forced to take whatever the listing brokerage thinks I should get. I have always had a problem with me. I'm the buyer agent. I'm the buyer brokerage company. I'll speak that way, use that. My buyer and I should determine what my value is to him, not you, the listing agent. So you and the buyer decide what your value is. The buyer can either pay you at the closing. So if you have a buyer representation agreement, it calls for you to get paid X percent. One of the options is the buyer could pay you at the closing, write you out a check, so to speak. Or they always have the option of asking the seller to pay it. I know that some of you right now just sat up and went, oh, no. We can't write anything into the sales contract. 100% agree with you. We're not talking about us writing anything into the contract. That's a contract between the buyers and the sellers. If the buyer wants the seller to pay so if you're offering X, my buyer representation agreement is for Y, 1% difference between X and Y. Can my buyer ask your seller to pay that compensation? Yes, they can. In every state, yes, they can. All right. Because the license law cannot dictate to the consumer what they do with their sales contract. It can dictate to us what we do with the sales contract, but they really don't have any jurisdiction over the consumer. Or the buyer can say they don't want to look at the property at all. And I know, especially for any of you who've only gotten into the real estate business in the last couple of years, you look at that and you go, well, that's ridiculous. The buyers are never going to choose that. Well, that's because we've had no inventory. But many of us have been around long enough to know that the market changes. It's already in the process of changing in many, many parts of the country. And when there are 15 other houses for sale in the subdivision or 15 other units for sale in that building, and the buyers can get what they owe their brokerage company covered by other listings, they'll go look at other listings. We see it already. This is already happening. So I can do all of that if I have a buyer representation agreement. If I have a buyer representation agreement and I have my buyer's permission, I can call you, the listing agent, before I show the property and ask if your seller will pay more. So if there's a 1% difference between what you're offering and what my buyer owes me, yes, I can call and ask. And you do have to ask the seller. You can't make that decision yourself. And if the seller agrees, then we've got to get everything in writing. We all know that. But now we can get it done that way. If the seller does not agree, then the buyer, again, decides whether or not they want to look at the property. They can pay the brokerage or they can use the sales contract to ask the seller. So yes, the idea that the compensation is not negotiable it's what the Code of Ethics and the license law says is that I cannot unilaterally change the offer of compensation once we start negotiating. Once you bring the offer to me, I cannot unilaterally say, we're going to give you less commission. There is nothing in the Code of Ethics at all. And NAR on some of the white papers, if you will, that they've got there for us is literally telling us that the brokerage companies can negotiate that commission ahead of time. So we as buyer agents need to understand this. And we as listing agents need to make sure we explain that to the sellers. So compensation is negotiable, but in most states, you must have a buyer representation agreement with the buyer. Otherwise, your commissioner's offices look at that in most states as I'm putting my interests ahead of my clients when I refuse to show a property or I try to get more commission out of the listing office because I'm supposed to be doing what's in the best interest of my client. If I have a buyer rep agreement, I am doing what's in the best interest of my client because he doesn't want to have to pay me that money at the closing if he can help it. He'd rather have it be part of the transaction. So let's talk about the buyers then. I am hoping that all of you are having a buyer counseling session with your buyers. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're going to have a much more in-depth conversation about that in our session in November. And you'll hear more about that when we get closer to that. So next month's session, by the way, is all about buyer appreciation. Yeah. And I think that is a great thing for you guys to tune into next month because we need to, and we've got a really good speaker for you coming that is really, really good at those buyer appreciation kind of things. So yeah, it's a good idea. So here's the issue for us. Prior to providing any kind of service, most professions have a counseling session first. So we need to make sure that we are having a counseling session with our buyers. And that counseling session, we wouldn't think of listing a property without having a seller counseling session. Why are we're trying to get buyers to sign buyer rep agreements without a counseling session? Oh, really? No wonder they won't sign them sometimes.
Right.
So they just don't want, we meet them for 5 minutes and go sign here.
No thanks.
No thanks. Yeah, pretty much. So most consumers want someone on their side. The problem is most buyers don't understand what it is that we do. The only way they're going to understand that is the counseling session. So we're going to be focusing most of this, the last few minutes here on talking about compensation. What we're going to do in November is talk more about our value proposition, because you got to do both. So we do need to, because I can't even do this part of it without talking value proposition a little bit. Mm-hmm. What makes you stand out? Why are you unique? Why should a buyer choose to work with you instead of the other 800 agents or 8,000 agents in your marketplace? If you can't answer that question, then how are you going to be able to tell the buyer why they should choose you? So you need to prepare yourself for this buyer counseling, because many of us have not been doing a buyer counseling. We've been doing kind of like, we work for Jack in the Box Real Estate. Buyer calls, wants to look at the house. We jump up and go show houses. And we're missing the opportunity to have these conversations. So I didn't want to pass up the opportunity to just kind of in general say, before I talk specifics on the compensation, the contents of your buyer counseling session needs to be pretty much all of this, what the buyer needs and wants. We need to make sure that the buyer is qualified both motivationally and financially. We need to make sure they understand what we do to help them find the right property. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, this is what I do. This is what we do to earn our compensation, to help you find the right house at the right property at the right price, negotiate the best price and terms, and make sure your transaction gets to the closing table. Don't miss the part about getting it to the closing table, because that is where a lot of our work is. It's a lot of where we earn our keep, and they don't understand any of it. Michelle and I were talking about that yesterday. As a buyer, sometimes the buyers sit at the closing table. They don't even know how we got there. They don't know what they're going to do when they get there. I mean, we're just not doing a real good job of explaining all of that. So we want to make sure we talk to them about all of that. So now, the buying process. And this one, and I know it might be a little bit hard to see on the screen, and it wasn't meant for you necessarily to copy this, but you should have a step-by-step, and please don't make it be, 85 steps. Nobody's going to read through something that's got 85 steps on it. Find the big steps of the buying process and educate your buyers on what the buying process is, what they need to do, what you're going to do, and how this whole transaction goes from the first thing we need to do is get you pre-approved for your mortgage. And then the last thing on your list is we're going to coordinate everything to get to a successful closing. What happens in between? Because the buyers don't get it. The average buyer does not understand it at all. So we need to make sure we put that together. So what I'm going to show you on the next couple of slides are some scripts. I am a believer that if I can give you some scripting, not that I want you to memorize my scripts. It's not that I want you to sound like me. That's not what we want. But it's easier for you to create your own script when you've got somebody else's as a guide. So the symbol you're going to see on these slides is scripting that you can adapt to your style and your personality. I need to very specifically say no implication of compensation being charged or being offered is implied in any of the scripting. So anything that you see that shows compensation XX or whatever is always negotiable, should always be conveyed as that. And okay, I think I did my antitrust disclaimer. We're good. So if I do not have a buyer rep agreement, this is what it sounds like with the buyer. Jack, Sally, Joe, Sue, whoever. This is what we do to assist you in finding the right property at the right price, negotiate an offer that is in your best interest, and handle the transaction through to closing. So I've already done my value proposition. I'm now getting into talking about compensation. We do this, and our compensation, which in our marketplace, as you can see in our MLS printouts and stuff, ranges anywhere from X to Z. Does that make sense? So it's a range, and sometimes it's less. And we don't get compensated till we go to the closing. We do not use buyer rep agreements, so we will be taking what the listing office or seller is agreeing to pay. When we find the property you are interested in, we will discuss what the actual compensation on that property is. And that's how you have to do it. Now, for some of you, the compensation is showing up on the client copy of your MLS printout. And that is a very, very good thing for us moving forward. I happen to be on the board of our MLS here in Chicagoland, and I know that ours will be on there very, very shortly. So we won't, whether you have a buyer rep agreement or not, the amount of compensation that you're going to make when your buyer buys this house will start to show up on your client copies. I can almost guarantee that that's going to happen for all of you eventually. All right. So if I do not have a written buyer representation agreement, then I disclose the range of compensation. Prior to writing the offer, I disclose the actual compensation. I must show all properties that fit my buyer's needs, regardless of the compensation. If there is an offer in the MLS of compensation of 4 cents in a chicken, I don't have a buyer rep agreement with my buyer. And that property is perfect for my buyer. There is not a license law that I am aware of, and I'm licensed to teach in 30 states, so it's the majority of the states. I know of no state license law that allows you as a buyer agent to put your interests ahead of your clients. So you are pretty much now going to, here's where we're at. If you don't like the offer of compensation, you're either going to work for whatever the listing office is paying. You're going to tell the buyer they can go look at that house with somebody else. Oh, I want to be a fly on the wall when you have that conversation with your buyer. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I'll be happy to show you these other 5 houses because I get paid what I think I'm worth. But you can go look at this house with whomever you'd like, but they're not paying me what I think. If that's the conversation you're having, and it's the first time the buyer's heard anything about compensation, I think you're dead in the water. Or you can have them sign a buyer representation agreement. And then we go back to what are your steps if you have a buyer rep agreement. So the moral of this little story, why aren't you getting a buyer representation agreement signed in the very, very beginning? Because it takes care of all of this. Because that 4 cents in a chicken may be all you get if that's all that's being offered and you don't have a buyer rep agreement. All right. So now with a buyer rep agreement, what does it sound like? We've already talked to the seller about all of this. So what does it sound like with the buyers? Most buyer representation agreements say something like this. If during the terms of this contract or the protection period, the buyer enters into a contract to acquire real estate and it closes, the buyer agrees to pay a brokerage fee of something. Okay. That's typically what's in a buyer rep agreement. So what happens then is us having to have the conversation of how this is going to happen. Because as we said, a lot of the buyers do not have an extra whatever percentage to pay us at the closing. So Jack and Sally, there is no time that you will have to write out a check and pay our compensation if you don't want to. As a matter of fact, you are paying it in the amount you offer to the seller. The seller has factored our compensation into the amount the listing office is offering us in the MLS. If there is any time that our agreed upon brokerage fee is not included in the price, then I will tell you that before we even look at the property. And you have options at that point. You can choose not to look at the property. You can pay the compensation yourself at the closing, or, and I'm going to recommend that this is what you do, you can ask the seller to add it to what they've already agreed to with their brokerage company. Can your buyer write into the contract he wants the seller to pay an additional 1% compensation to your buyer brokerage company? And the answer is yes, they can. So the idea here that somehow or another that this paradigm shift we're dealing with is going to eliminate first-time home buyers or marginally qualified buyers or buyers without a ton of savings from even being able to buy is not true. They always have the ability to ask the seller. So if they question your value, if they say, I don't need you to find houses for me. Why am I paying this compensation? I want to work with, I don't need a buyer representation, a buyer rep. Language such as this, the 75 hours or however many hours you need in your state to get a license, okay, whatever that is. In Illinois, it happens to be 75. The 75 hours spent getting a license is not what prepares me to represent you. I have spent over, and again, you have to fill in that blank, 100 hours learning about buyer representation and years becoming a market expert to assist you in the largest single investment you will probably make in your life, and one that shapes your family for years to come. The internet, no argument, is a tool for you, and for me, for that matter, to help find property. But everything that is available is not always on the internet. It is in our MLS. So there are properties in our MLS that are not necessarily available on the internet. You figure out how to explain that depending on your MLS. And real estate is a human relationship that cannot be managed through algorithms and formulas and apps. We have to be able to have conversations. We have to be able to understand how the market affects us. What I bring to you is not just the hours, and they are numerous, that I put in to find you the right property at the best price and terms and make sure we get to the closing table. By the way, I will repeat that 82 times if I need to with both my buyers and sellers. It's the years of experience and the constant effort that I put in to stay on top of an ever-changing marketplace. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to have the language ready. You need to be able to define your value and your worth, which is why we decided that in November, we're going to do another one of these, and we're going to focus only on the value proposition. We're going to take where we're leaving off today, because the last part of this says the compensation paid to the buyer brokerage has historically, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, been paid by the seller at the closing. So out of the proceeds the seller has available, based on how much you're willing to pay the seller, the compensation has been paid arguably by the buyer all along. It's just a bit more transparent now. So we got to change our dialogue. That is exactly what this was all about. So we hope that this has given you some insight and ideas for how to navigate our changing real estate space, because guys, it's changing. And we got to be ready to change with it, or we're going to get left behind. So just a reminder that some of the courses that we have some in-depth information on this topic, where we spent every one of those courses, the ABR, the SRS, the RENE, those are all 2-day courses. We just covered something in about 30 minutes. But we just wanted to give you some insight into how you might need to navigate this. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle and let you kind of wrap it up a little bit.
All right.
A couple of things you wanted to mention to them again.
Yeah, so Lynn mentioned the courses that are available, and we actually have a fairly new course called the Home Finance Resource Certification course. And that actually is going to be a live virtual course on October 12th. And if you're interested in, maybe getting a refresher on the mortgage process and how to better explain that to your buyer clients, this is a great course to take. The early bird rate is available through September 30th. So wanted to put that out there. And I also wanted to give everybody a little bonus that if you're interested in receiving a copy of Lynn's scripts regarding compensation, if you comment on the video with your email address, we will send that to you later this week. And I just want to remind everyone that we are still live. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them here. If you see this video after the fact, feel free to comment as well. We will try to channel all those questions directly to Lynn.
Yes.
And that's about it. So I just thank you so much, Lynn, and thank you to everyone who joined us today.
Yes.
I hope that you found this compensation conversation to be helpful. As a reminder, please be sure to defer to your managing broker for specific questions about your market. Like Lynn said, some states have different requirements for their licensees. And like Lynn mentioned, be sure to join us next month on October 12th with Karen Stang, and Lynn will be back with us in November. So thank you everyone again, and we will see you next time.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.